What is your name and what have you written?
Hi, my name is Marc Bona. I'm a features writer for Cleveland.com, and I've written 3 books, and I have a 4th coming out this year. I wrote a novel that came out in 2018 called The Game Changer. In 2021, I had 2 books that came out, so now you know how I spent the coronavirus pandemic. Hidden History of Cleveland Sports, which is exactly what it says. I tried to uncover some gems that really crossed about 100 years. We're looking at the 1890s to the early 1990s, bunch of different sports, and had a lot of fun with that. And really the goal in that was every time I would chip away at something, I thought, oh, I didn't know that, and I thought maybe other people would feel the same way. And I also had a book that came out called The Reason We Play, which is a series of biographical portraits of famous athletes and coaches. And I really went after a lot of diversity with this. They're young and old, men and women, former athletes, current athletes, all different sports. I have about 24 of them, and every chapter ends with what their favorite book or book was as a kid, along with some words of advice that they're offering for youth today. And then finally, my 4th book is a biography of Joe Thomas. I co-authored it with Dan Murphy of the Cleveland Browns. He's in the front office, and he and I worked on kind of a unique book because it's half biography and half autobiography. And that is due out August 1st, 2023, 5 days before Joe gets elected into the Hall of Fame.
Excellent. Excellent. How long have you been writing about Cleveland sports?
Really for a long time. I have loved sports history since I was a kid, and I've moved around a lot. I've lived I live in Akron, so I've been here. I started at the Plain Dealer in 2000 and was in an editing role for a long time. And when I became a full-time writer, I really was given a chance to kind of control some of my own beats, and one of them is sports history. And every chance I get, I love to write about sports history. It's been a passion of mine since I was a kid, and now I have an avenue to write about it.
Now, there's been a lot written about Cleveland sports, but usually it's the same few stories being told and retold. LeBron, Bob Feller, shot, the fumble. What made you want to write the hidden history of Cleveland sports?
I think you just answered the question, Jason. When an editor called me from the History Press several years ago, he had read my stuff and he said, you know, I think you'd be a really good person to write about history of Cleveland sports. And at the time, we had no parameters on it. And I said, I will do it. And right off the bat, I said, I only have one demand. And that's, I will not write about the shot, the drive, the fumble. They have been written about ad nauseum, and it's just too much. So he said, fine. The lesser known stories, the better. And they were really, really fun to find.
Now, when you're researching this book, did you already know some of the stories you wanted to tell, or were you starting with a clean slate?
I knew some of them, and I would just stumble into, it was very organic, I would just stumble into stories. Sometimes they would make for a good feature for Cleveland.com. Others I just kind of squirreled away for the book. The one example that I'll talk about is, and I'll just give a little taste of it now, is in 1993 there was a horrific accident that shook the entire world, the entire baseball world. It was a horrible accident. 2 pitchers on the Cleveland Indians at spring training were killed in a boating accident. And it garnered a lot of attention, as it should. That happened in March. But what people don't remember is in December of that year, just months later, there was another accident. It was another player. He was another pitcher on the same team, on the same staff, who died tragically. So I'll get into that as well.
I think I remember the boating accident because that was Steve Olin, right?
That's right.
That was the sidearm.
Tim Cruz and Steve Olin, that's correct.
I would say he was the best pitcher we had at the time.
That's about right.
What anecdote surprised you the most during your research?
I think that was actually one of them because I had no clue about this other player dying so tragically. There were so many stories. I mean, every chapter has a story after story after story. When I talk to young journalists in high school or college, I always say there's 2 rules. 1, there's always a story, and 2, there's always another story. And I really found a lot of things. One of the biggest things that I kind of pulled together, I realized it was a real big aha moment, was At a certain point in the 1970s, and if we got into all the details now, we'd be here for an hour, but because of the way the ownership of the Indians was going and the team was up for sale, the Cavs had already moved to Richfield. Very quietly, Art Modell of the Browns had bought some land in Strongsville. If certain things had gone a certain way, there was a chance in the 1970s that the city of Cleveland, which really wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things, would not have had any major sports franchises. And luckily and fortunately, that didn't happen.
Now, there's another anecdote in your book about how George Steinbrenner came very close to purchasing the Cleveland Indians.
That's exactly right, and that ties right into what I just said. You're absolutely right, Jason. He got so close to buying the Indians that he had a press conference set. And when journalists are called for a press conference, that means everything is set. There's contracts in place, the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, and reporters showed up. It was in downtown Cleveland, and George got a phone call from Vernon Stouffer, who was in Arizona at the time. And Vernon was getting cold feet, and he backed out of the deal. And all of a sudden, George is left with a room full of reporters and his public relations man, and they had to scramble. And so this deal in the 11th and a half hour ends up dying. It just dies, it goes away, and Steinbrenner doesn't buy the team. And it really kicks into motion a giant what if. I'm fascinated by what if scenarios based on facts that happened and history that happened. And it wasn't that much longer. I want to say it was a year and a half later, ballpark, where George Steinbrenner then went to and bought the New York Yankees. That rate for a lot more money than what he was quibbling with Stouffer to buy the Indians for. And it really begs the question, would Steinbrenner have opened his checkbook in Cleveland the way he opened it in New York? And that may have been a game changer. The Indians were not that good at the time. And free agency was also in its infancy at the time. So Steinbrenner came along, whether you like him or don't like him, he came along at the right time for him because of the way he treated free agency and paying players. So would that have been applied to Cleveland? Yeah, maybe, maybe not.
Were there any stories that you loved that you couldn't fit in the book?
Wow. You know, there weren't. I got everything. I got the outline done. I researched. I wrote it. It was edited and we published it. But I knew going into, I knew when I was writing this that there were going to be enough stories out there for a second volume. And I pretty much have finished an outline, and I need to really buckle down and get some of the research done before I get the writing done. There's clearly enough out there for a second book, and I think I can just keep going and going and going. I don't like to necessarily sit down and just look for sports trivia. I like them to kind of come to me when I'm researching something. I always use the term rabbit holes. I pull the string and you go down this hole and this hole and this hole, and all of a sudden you find this unbelievable gem that's a really neat story. That leads to feature stories for me, for my job, and it leads to potential chapters in the book. So at some point I will get this done, but I just finished the Joe Thomas book as we speak, is in editing right now, and I hope to jump back in and do the second volume of Hidden History of Cleveland Sports.
Wonderful. So anybody who knows you knows that your two great loves in this world are alcoholic libations and sports.
You make it sound kind of bad, but you're right. I do get a chance to write about beer and wine as well as food and restaurants. I like to say I have probably the most fun job on the planet. It's been really, really great. I've been at ball games where people have come up to me and they hear what I do. They say, can I be your intern? And talking about grown men. It's like, no, I got it covered. No, but I do get to write about the fun stuff.
So I have to ask, did you get to combine your two loves and write about 10-cent beer night?
I did, and I'll be talking about that tonight. And as we record this on June 5th, 2023, June 4th, 1974 was the date of that infamous night, 10-cent beer night at Cleveland Municipal Stadium. I spent over a week researching and writing that story, and no, I did have a couple beers after I finished writing.
Right. Now, I'm going to make some risky assumptions here, so this might not pan out. So I've got a really roundabout way to get my next question, and it's based on some flimsy ground. I'm going to guess, based upon your last name, that you're part Sicilian.
Not Sicilian, but Italian, so you get half a point.
Half a point. Okay, as an Italian growing up around the Cleveland area, I'm going to guess you care about boxing.
I did not grow up in Cleveland. I've been here over 20 years, but I do like boxing.
There aren't a lot of opportunities to sell boxing stories right now, but Cleveland's got some great boxing history.
Yeah.
Were you able to A, unearth any good boxing stories, and B, were you excited to be able to tell them?
Yeah, great point. I agree with that. And boxing is a hard sell right now because MMA is so big. Now, my personal preference is I do like boxing, and I think it's obviously rich with history. The main story I wrote was about Johnny Kilbane. So a true Cleveland sports fan probably knows a little bit about Johnny Kilbane. I learned quite a bit about him. The two big things about him: he was a dynastic champion. He held the belt for over a decade. That is difficult to do at any weight class of any era. So I think he needs to be respected for that. And the other thing is, when he won the title, and this goes back over 100 years ago, there was a parade in Cleveland that was never seen before, and the only one since really was for the 2016 Cavs winning the championship. And it was just amazing how people knew he was coming by train all the way from California. He got stranded at one point, I want to say, in Kansas in a snowstorm. He comes in, and his father is waiting for him on the porch of his house where he lived on the west side of Cleveland. And it's just a neat story. And I've read everything from 100,000 to 200,000 people showing up. That's phenomenal when we're talking about well over 110 years ago.
So there are a lot of books on local sports available. As a journalist, you've read a lot of them. Are there any favorites that you recommend to somebody?
Yeah, I have a strong bias here, but the two people I think who are doing a tremendous job both writing and researching, my colleague Terry Pluto has written many books, and the joke on Terry is there was once a rain delay in a press box and somebody piped up, "Oh, Pluto just came out with another book." So it's an old joke, and it's an oldie but a goodie. Terry is excellent. He's prolific. The amount of copy he produces, and nothing is beneath him. He had a story this week about the Case Western tennis team doing so well. He doesn't. A lot of big name sports columnists in other cities would never think of covering a Division III school or setting foot on their campus. He has no problem with that, and he writes about a lot of things. The other person I would suggest is Scott Longert, who is a wonderful guy. He's a retired park ranger, and he's covering the Cleveland Indians' history kind of in a chronological order, not in nice, neat decades, but by era. So he had one of his books, for instance, is on the Depression era. That was very important in Cleveland history, in any city's history, because you had two ballparks in use for a while simultaneously. It took quite a bit to get Cleveland Municipal Stadium built. I believe it was a WPA project. Scott has done a great job, and he's at work now. I think he's coming out pretty soon with a book. I think he's up into the 1950s.
I think he's doing the Calavito era now,
Yes.
because the last one was the 1948 team.
Right.
The book you're referencing, if I'm remembering it correctly, was No Beers, No Pennants. There was a third no in there, but spectacular writer, spectacular researcher.
Yeah, he's done a really nice job. And then finally, I would give a shout out to somebody who's not a Clevelander. He's a young guy in his 30s, and his name is Luke Eplin. He's I don't know if I want to say up and coming writer, because he's definitely established. He's actually working on a book about the Philadelphia 76ers now, but last year he came out with a book on the 1948 Indians. And if you think you know everything about the 48 Indians, this was so well done and so smart, because what he did was he took four critical people close to the team, between owner and players, and basically wove four biographies into one book. So most of us don't have the time to read 500-page definitive biographies on anyone or anything. Here he is in less than 300 pages, weaving together four. His writing was brilliant, and his research was incredible. So Luke Eplin's book is called Our Team, the story of the 1948 Indians.
When are you going to write a book on local brewery history?
I am not going to write a book on local brewery history, because that is a market that is, I think the only way I could put that is it's ever changing. And I literally, I've actually had this debate slash mild argument with my editor who wanted me to do a story a few years ago on the 50 best beers in Cleveland. And I said, by the time I get done writing that story, half those beers won't even be on the market. It is very difficult to do. It is something that is a good online project for somebody because you have to have the ability to change it out. Breweries open and breweries close, mostly open. We're in a very, very healthy market, the entire state as well as Northeast Ohio. I think volume-wise, right now we're well over 400, around 420, and we're probably in the top 5 or 6 of states by number of breweries in terms of volume. But that's not for me. It would just go. I write pretty fast, but I would be outdated in a heartbeat.
Also, the research might destroy your liver. Yeah.
So true. As I tell my editor, I'm drinking as fast as I can.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, that's it. I am very appreciative of libraries and the message that libraries foster. I'm a huge believer in reading. I think it opened up a lot of worlds for me when I was a kid, and I think it can do that for any kid today of any age.
Thank you so much for your time.